The Galactic Combat Academy of Nexus Prime had built its reputation on three fundamental principles: precision, safety, and the absolute certainty that violence could be refined into an art form suitable for civilized beings. For over 2 millennia, the Academy had churned out combat instructors, diplomatic guards, and security specialists for a galaxy that prided itself on having evolved beyond the barbaric need for actual fighting. Their training halls were marvels of engineering, equipped with force dampeners, neural inhibitors, and enough safety protocols to make a paranoid engineer weep with joy. And what they had not accounted for, in all their infinite wisdom and technological superiority, was the day the Terran exchange program would deposit a human student at their pristine doorstep. Director Qu'lynn, a nervous Valtaxian whose species had achieved sentience roughly around the time they discovered that conflict resolution through interpreted dance was remarkably effective, stood in her crystalline office reviewing the morning's incident reports. Her 6 delicate arms shuffled through holographic documents, while her compound eyes darted between surveillance feeds from Training Hall Omega-7. The feeds showed what appeared to be the aftermath of a small natural disaster, complete with scattered debris, bewildered alien students, and one very calm human female sitting in the medical bay with blood streaming from her nose. The irony was not lost on Qu'lynn that the most advanced combat training facility and 3 spiral arms had just been effectively shut down by what the humans quaintly called a minor disagreement. 3 hours earlier, Instructor Vex'tal had strutted into Training Hall Omega-7 with the confidence of a being whose species had spent the last 500 years perfecting the art of combat through mathematical precision. The Chitinoids, as they were known throughout the galaxy, approached fighting the way other species approached quantum physics, with rigid formulas, calculated movements, and the absolute certainty that superior intellect could overcome any physical disadvantage. Vex'tal's carapace gleamed under the hall's artificial lighting as he surveyed his mixed-species class. His compound eyes, capable of processing 17 different spectrums of light simultaneously, catalogued each student with clinical efficiency. There were the usual suspects, a pair of Xenthian twins whose gaseous forms required specialized containment suits for physical training, 3 Corellian students whose crystalline bodies made them excellent at defensive maneuvers and terrible at everything else, and a small cluster of Mintakan younglings who had achieved interstellar travel before they had figured out how to make their limbs stop trembling during combat exercises. And then there was the human. Zara Nightwind sat cross-legged on the training mat, her posture relaxed in a way that made every other species in the room unconsciously nervous. She was, by galactic standards, a perfectly average representative of her species, bipedal, covered in the peculiar organic armor humans called skin, and possessed of the unsettling habit of showing her teeth when she was pleased about something. What the other students found particularly disturbing was her tendency to remain perfectly still for long periods, like a predator conserving energy before a strike. The humans had been admitted to the galactic community only recently, after a rather embarrassing first contact incident where their diplomatic vessel had accidentally destroyed 3 pirate ships, rescued a Corellian merchant convoy, and somehow managed to negotiate a favorable trade agreement while their captain was still apologizing for the misunderstanding. The prevailing wisdom among galactic society was that humans were a charming but primitive species who showed remarkable potential once they learned to control their more violent impulses. Vex'tal had read the species briefing on humans exactly once, had found it both boring and irrelevant, and had promptly filed it away in the mental equivalent of a junk drawer. In his professional opinion, any species could be taught proper combat technique through the application of superior instruction and mathematical principles. The fact that humans came from what the galaxy politely termed a high-gravity death world, it was merely an interesting footnote, roughly equivalent to noting that Corellians were silicon-based, or that Valtaxians could see in 17 dimensions. Today, Vex'tal announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a being who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of correct procedure, we will be reviewing defensive postures through practical application. The exercise is simple. I will demonstrate proper striking technique on a volunteer, and you will observe the correct defensive response. His multifaceted eyes swept across the class and settled on Zara, with the inevitability of a mathematical equation reaching its conclusion. She was, after all, the largest student present, and therefore the most suitable for demonstration purposes. The fact that she represented a species the Academy had literally zero experience training was in Vex'tal's mind merely an opportunity to showcase the universal applicability of proper technique. "You," he said, gesturing toward Zara with one of his forearms, "will serve as the demonstration partner." The other students shifted nervously. The Xenthian twins' containment suits hummed with increased activity. The Corallians made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. The Mintakins simply stopped trembling, which was somehow more ominous than their usual constant motion. Zara uncrossed her legs and stood with the fluid grace of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy space. She was neither tall nor short by human standards, but in a room full of beings whose evolutionary paths had prioritized intellect over physical capability, she looked like a statue of some ancient warrior goddess who had wandered into a philosophy lecture by mistake. "What would you like me to do?" she asked, her voice carrying the neutral politeness that humans used when they were being cooperative, but had not yet decided whether they liked you. Vex'tal positioned himself in what his species considered the optimal striking stance, weight distributed according to mathematical precision, primary striking arms extended at the angles that would deliver maximum force with minimum effort, secondary arms positioned for defensive support. It was a pose that had been refined over centuries of Chitinoid martial development, and was, according to every manual ever written on the subject, absolutely perfect. "Simply maintain a standard defensive posture," he instructed. "I will demonstrate a controlled strike to the midsection and you will execute the appropriate blocking technique. The safety dampeners will ensure that no actual contact occurs." What Vex'tal failed to account for, in his supremely confident calculation, was that the safety dampeners had been designed for species whose idea of dangerous physical activity was competitive meditation. They were calibrated for beings whose bone density was roughly equivalent to foam insulation and whose muscle fibers generated about as much force as a stiff breeze. They were not designed for a Chitinoid instructor whose exoskeleton was harder than most starship hulls and whose striking power had been mathematically optimized for maximum efficiency. They were certainly not designed to compensate for the interaction between such an instructor and a human whose homeworld had spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything that lived on its surface. Vex'tal launched into his demonstration strike with the precision of a chronometer and the confidence of someone who had performed this exact exercise 1,743 times without incident. His primary striking arm moved in a perfect arc, following the mathematical trajectory that would deliver precisely the right amount of force to demonstrate proper technique without causing harm. The safety dampeners, those marvels of galactic engineering, detected the incoming strike and immediately began calculating the appropriate level of intervention. They measured Vex'tal's mass, velocity, and force projection. They assessed Zara's defensive positioning and biological specifications. They consulted their extensive databases of safe interaction parameters for known galactic species. What they did not do, because no one had thought to program them for this possibility, was account for the fact that human defensive reflexes had been honed by millions of years of evolution on a planet where hesitation meant death and overreaction meant survival. Zara saw the strike coming with the clarity of someone whose ancestors had spent countless generations dodging everything from saber-toothed predators to falling rocks. Her body responded with the automatic precision of a system that had been field-tested in environments where physics itself seemed personally offended by the existence of life. She shifted her weight, angled her torso, and prepared to deflect what she assumed would be a carefully controlled training exercise. The safety dampeners meanwhile completed their calculations and determined that a 37% reduction in striking force would provide an adequate safety margin for the interaction. They engaged their field generators and confidently reduced Vex'tal's strike to what their programming considered a safe and educational level. For a Chitinoid striking another Chitinoid, this would have resulted in a gentle tap, a polite round of applause from the observing students, and another successful demonstration of proper defensive technique. For a Chitinoid striking a human, even a Chitinoid whose strike had been reduced by 37%, it resulted in something considerably more dramatic. Vex'tal's fist still traveling at roughly 2/3 of its intended velocity and carrying the full weight of his mathematical confidence connected with Zara's hastily raised defensive position. The safety dampeners registered the contact and immediately began congratulating themselves on another successful intervention. The displacement of 2 seconds of intervention, up to 2 seconds of thought. Zara felt the impact like being hit by a freight transport driven by someone who had learned to drive by reading the manual but had never encountered actual traffic. Her defensive posture, which had been perfectly adequate for dealing with human-scale training exercises, proved insufficient for dealing with an exoskeleton-enhanced strike backed by several centuries of Chitinoid martial optimization. The sound that echoed through Training Hall Omega-7 was the distinctive crack of cartilage giving way to physics. Blood began streaming from Zara's nose in a manner that would have sent most galactic species into immediate medical shock. Her head snapped back with enough force to make the Corellian students ring like temple bells. Her eyes watered in the involuntary biological response that humans experienced when their faces were forcibly rearranged. And then, in the sudden silence that followed, Zara did something that would have been completely impossible for any other known species in the galaxy. She smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was not the polite expression of goodwill that humans typically displayed during social interactions. It was the smile of a being whose genetic memory included countless ancestors who had looked at predators twice their size and thought, "I wonder if I can take that thing." Vex'tal, meanwhile, was experiencing what his species would later classify as the first recorded case of Chitinoid cognitive dissonance in over 3 centuries. His mathematical brain was attempting to process the fact that his perfectly calculated strike had produced an unexpected result. His defensive protocols were suggesting that blood was generally considered a sign that the training exercise had exceeded acceptable parameters. His professional pride was insisting that this was clearly an equipment malfunction, rather than any failure of technique. "Fascinating," he said, his voice carrying the detached interest of someone observing an unusual laboratory result. "It appears the safety dampeners require recalibration for your species' physiological parameters. Please report to the medical facility for assessment and adjustment." The other students watched this exchange with the horrified fascination of beings witnessing something that would be discussed in hushed tones for generations. The Zenthian twins had increased their containment field density to the point where their forms were barely visible. The Corellians had shifted into defensive formations that had not been seen since their planet's ancient wars. The Mintakans had achieved perfect stillness for the first time in recorded Mintakan history. Zara wiped the blood from her nose with the back of her hand, an action that produced a red smear across her knuckles that made every non-human in the room instinctively step backward. She looked at the blood for a moment with the clinical interest of someone assessing damage, then looked back at Vex'tal with an expression that could have been carved from stone. "Recalibration," she repeated, her voice carrying a flatness that somehow managed to be more ominous than any threat. "Right." What happened next would be analyzed by xenobiologists, combat theorists, and insurance adjusters for decades to come. Multiple theories would be proposed to explain the sequence of events that followed, ranging from the hypothesis that human reaction times operated on principles that violated known physics, to the suggestion that Zara had somehow developed prescient abilities during her brief exposure to galactic technology. The truth was considerably simpler and infinitely more terrifying. Humans had spent millions of years learning to react to immediate physical threats with a speed and efficiency that had impressed even the planet that was actively trying to kill them. Zara moved. There was no wind-up, no preparation, no mathematical calculation of optimal striking angles. One moment she was standing perfectly still, blood dripping from her nose, and the next moment she was inside Vex'tal's guard, with a speed that made the Academy's high defensive recording equipment struggle to track her movement. Her right hand closed around Vex'tal's primary striking arm, just below the joint where his exoskeleton was thinnest. Her left hand braced against his thorax. Her feet found purchase on the training mat with the automatic precision of someone whose balance had been tested by everything from earthquakes to meteor impacts. Vex'tal's compound eyes had just enough time to register the change in his tactical situation before Zara demonstrated why human military manuals included an entire chapter on leverage applications in close-quarters combat. She twisted. The sound that filled Training Hall Omega-7 was considerably different from the crack of breaking cartilage. It was the sharp snap of chitin fracturing under stress, followed immediately by the wet crunch of internal structures giving way to forces they had never been designed to handle. Vex'tal's perfectly calculated stance collapsed into chaos as his primary striking arm bent in a direction that Chitinoid anatomy had specifically evolved to prevent. his mathematical brain, still struggling to process the unexpected variables in what should have been a simple training exercise, finally managed to recognize the sensation flooding his nervous system as pain. He dropped to the training mat with the sound of expensive equipment falling downstairs. The silence that followed was the kind of absolute quiet that typically preceded either enlightenment or apocalypse. Every being in the room stood perfectly still, as if movement might somehow attract the attention of whatever primal force had just been unleashed in their midst. Zara released her grip on Vex'tal's arm and stepped back, wiping her bloody nose again with movements that were somehow more terrifying for their complete normalcy. She looked down at the writhing instructor with the expression of someone who had just completed a minor household chore. "I think," she said conversationally, "your safety dampeners might need more than recalibration." The Academy's emergency response protocols, designed by the same brilliant minds that had created the safety dampener system, immediately sprang into action, with the efficiency of a machine that had been optimized for dealing with minor training accidents. Medical drones descended from the ceiling, emergency containment fields activated, automated systems began broadcasting calm instructions about remaining stationary and allowing proper authorities to handle the situation. What these systems had not been programmed to handle was a situation where the proper authorities were currently lying on the floor, making sounds that suggested their species had not evolved an adequate vocabulary for expressing extreme physical discomfort. Director Qu'lynn arrived at Training Hall Omega-7 approximately 4 minutes after the automated systems registered what they politely classified as an unexpected training outcome. She had run the entire distance from her office, a feat that would have been impressive for a Valtaxian under normal circumstances, and bordered on miraculous, given that her species had not actually needed to run from anything in over 2,000 years. She burst through the training hall doors expecting to find the usual aftermath of a minor equipment malfunction, perhaps a bruised student, possibly some damaged training equipment, and definitely a lot of paperwork explaining how such incidents could be prevented in the future. What she found instead looked like the scene of a natural disaster that had been very specifically targeted at one particular individual. Vex'tal was being loaded onto a medical transport by a team of emergency responders who kept stopping their work to stare at his arm in professional bewilderment. The limb in question had been immobilized in a support framework that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never seen Chitinoid anatomy but had been given a very detailed description by a particularly creative storyteller. The other students had arranged themselves around the perimeter of the training hall in what could charitably be called defensive positions, but looked more like the formation typically adopted by prey animals who had just witnessed something eat their natural predator. And in the center of it all, Zara sat on a medical examination platform, while an Exarian medic named Healer Zephyra attempted to treat her broken nose with the sort of gentle care typically reserved for defusing explosive devices. "What happened?" Qu'lynn asked, though her tone suggested that she was not entirely certain she wanted to know. Healer Zephyra looked up from her examination with the expression of someone who had just discovered that their medical training had not covered the treatment of beings whose circulatory systems appeared to operate on principles that violated several fundamental laws of biology. "The human female has sustained a nasal fracture," she reported, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that might cause widespread panic. "Her vital signs are stable, though I confess I am not entirely certain what constitutes normal parameters for her species. The blood loss appears to be within acceptable limits, although she has declined pain management medication." "I'm fine," Zara added helpfully, her voice slightly nasal due to the broken cartilage. "It's just a nosebleed." Qu'lynn stared at the human for a moment, trying to reconcile the casual dismissal of what appeared to be significant facial trauma with the fact that one of her most experienced instructors was currently being transported to the medical facility with injuries that the Academy's computer systems were classifying as theoretically impossible. "And Instructor Vex'tal?" Healer Zephyra consulted her diagnostic tablet with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly challenging mathematical equation. "Compound fracture of the primary striking appendage, with associated damage to the secondary support structures. The injury pattern is unusual. It appears to have been caused by a rotational force applied with considerable precision to the weakest point of his exoskeletal structure." "How is that possible?" Qu'lynn asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I believe," Healer Zephyra said carefully, That would be a question better directed at the human. All eyes in the training hall turned to Zara, who was now holding a cold compress to her nose with the sort of casual competence that suggested she had treated similar injuries before. She looked around at the assembled faces with the patient expression of someone who had found herself having to explain something very obvious to a room full of intelligent beings who had somehow missed the point. "It broke my nose," she said simply. "So I broke his arm." The statement hung in the air with the weight of absolute logic, delivered in a tone that suggested the speaker found the situation as straightforward as basic arithmetic. No one in the room seemed to know how to respond to such a concise summary of what their advanced sensor systems had recorded as a complex tactical engagement involving multiple phases of attack, counterattack, and resolution. Qu'lynn felt a headache beginning to form somewhere behind her compound eyes. It was the sort of headache that typically preceded major policy revisions, extensive equipment upgrades, and the kind of interdepartmental meetings that ended with everyone agreeing that the problem was far too complex for any individual to solve. "That," she said slowly, "is not how combat training exercises are supposed to work." Zara shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both apology and complete lack of remorse. "Maybe you should mention that to your safety dampeners. They seem to have some gaps in their programming." Over the following hours, as reports were filed and statements were taken and medical equipment was recalibrated for species that apparently considered significant blood loss a minor inconvenience, a picture began to emerge of what had actually occurred in Training Hall Omega-7. The Academy's investigation revealed that the safety dampener system had functioned exactly as designed, reducing Vex'tal's strike force by the predetermined safety margin that had been calculated based on extensive testing with known galactic species. The problem was not with the equipment, but with the fundamental assumption that all intelligent species would have similar physiological responses to controlled physical contact. The humans, it appeared, represented what the investigative report would eventually classify as a novel biological paradigm that operated on principles the galaxy's advanced civilization had never encountered. They possessed reaction times that bordered on precognitive, pain tolerance that suggested either evolutionary adaptation or psychological disorder, and a tendency to respond to injuries with what could only be described as mild annoyance. More troubling from an administrative perspective was their apparent ability to analyze complex biomechanical systems in real time and identify structural weaknesses with the precision of an advanced engineering scanner. Zara's counterattack had not been a random act of retaliation, but a carefully calculated application of force that had targeted the exact point where Chitinoid exoskeletal structure was most vulnerable to rotational stress. When asked how she had known where to strike, Zara had looked at the investigating committee with the expression of someone being asked to explain why water was wet. "You could see the joint articulation," she had said. "Basic anatomy, everything has weak points if you know how to look." The committee members, representing 7 different species with a combined total of over 12,000 years of educational achievement, had spent the next 3 hours trying to understand how a being from a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel could possess intuitive knowledge of biomechanics that their most advanced medical schools taught as graduate-level coursework. The answer, when it finally emerged, was as simple as it was terrifying. Humans had evolved on a planet where everything they encountered was trying to kill them, and they had survived by becoming very good at killing it first. Director Qu'lynn spent the next week reviewing safety protocols, consulting with medical specialists, and trying to figure out how to explain to the Galactic Educational Council that their most prestigious combat academy had been effectively neutralized by a single exchange student who had been on campus for less than a standard galactic month. The solution, when it finally presented itself, was both elegant and pragmatic. If you couldn't safely train humans using existing methods, you changed the methods. The Terran Combat Integration Protocol, as it would eventually be known throughout galactic educational circles, represented a complete departure from traditional academy training. Instead of attempting to teach humans to fight like other galactic species, the new program focused on teaching other galactic species how to fight alongside humans without getting accidentally maimed in the process. Zara, meanwhile, had been transferred from the standard curriculum to what the Academy diplomatically termed specialized independent study. This consisted primarily of her sitting in an empty training hall, reading technical manuals, and occasionally demonstrating human combat techniques to rooms full of advanced military strategists who took notes with the intensity of beings documenting a natural phenomenon. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that the most advanced combat training facility in the galaxy had been forced to completely restructure its entire educational philosophy because of a species that had learned to fight by being terrible at everything else. 3 months later, when the first class of Terran integrated combat specialists graduated from the academy, Director Qu'lynn stood at her office window and watched them conduct their final exercises. The new training protocols incorporated human-scale safety measures, human-compatible equipment, and most importantly, human instructors who understood the difference between controlled force and attempted murder. Instructor Vex'tal had made a complete recovery, though his primary striking arm now included several synthetic components that made it considerably stronger than the original. He had also developed what his medical team described as a healthy respect for human defensive capabilities, which translated to a teaching style that involved considerably more explanation and considerably less demonstration. As for Zara, she had completed her exchange program with distinction and returned to Earth with a letter of recommendation that described her as a student whose approach to problem-solving represents innovative thinking that challenges traditional assumptions about conflict resolution. What the letter did not mention, though it was widely discussed in faculty meetings for years afterward, was that she had single-handedly proven that the galaxy's understanding of combat, violence, and the nature of intelligent life itself was woefully inadequate for dealing with species that had learned to survive by being unreasonably good at controlled mayhem. The Galactic Combat Academy continued to train students in the arts of civilized warfare, but their recruitment materials now included a small footnote that advised prospective instructors to review supplementary materials on non-standard physiological responses to training stimuli before accepting positions involving species from high-gravity worlds. Because if there was one thing the galaxy's most advanced educational institution had learned from its encounter with human pragmatism, it was that evolution was a considerably more creative instructor than any curriculum could account for, and students who had been taught by 4 billion years of planetary hostility tended to approach problem-solving with methods that made traditional academic theory look like a polite suggestion rather than established fact. The safety dampeners, meanwhile, had been upgraded with new programming that accounted for species whose idea of minor injury included broken bones, significant blood loss, and structural damage that would have sent most galactic citizens into medical shock. The updated system worked flawlessly, though it had the unfortunate side effect of making training exercises involving non-human species feel like gentle massage therapy, which was exactly the sort of ironic outcome that made the galaxy's ongoing relationship with humanity both fascinating and deeply concerning, depending on your perspective on the value of predictable educational outcomes versus the entertainment value of watching advanced civilizations discover that their assumptions about the nature of intelligent life were considerably more flexible than they had previously believed,